going to start us off with two questions. And these two questions are going to introduce what I'm going to do for the rest of the time, which is overview the book. Now, fortunately, as you're probably guessing with this cool stuff on the table over here, that will involve what the citizen soldier in action looks like. All right, well, let's start off with our two questions. The first, how did Rome survive so many battle defeats? Let me just give you the most devastating and the most important. We know the Etruscans, sometime in the 470s, possibly 477 or so, defeat the Roman army, possibly wipe out most of a clan at the Battle of the Cremera in the 470s. Then the Gauls, 3/4 of a century later, swoop down into northern Italy and they defeat a Roman army. I say defeat, but what really happens is the Roman army kind of pulls a Monty Python and just runs away. And that's, bye-bye. It's humiliating, but then the Gauls take possession of the city, probably everything except for the citadel. Fast forward a few more decades, and we've got another catastrophic defeat, another humiliating surrender. This time, you've got the Samnites, these people from the mountainous area in central Italy. They corner and surround a Roman army at a site called the Caudine Forks. The Roman army has to walk under the yoke. It's 3 spears put together as a sign of their submission to the Samnites. But the worst was still coming, because we've got the heir of Alexander, Pyrrhus of Epirus. He's actually a cousin of Alexander, a one-time contender to the Macedonian throne. He's going to lead an expeditionary force of those feared Macedonian Phalangites, the kind of guys who would conquer the Persian Empire, and they're going to inflict 2 devastating defeats on the Romans, one at 280, one at 279. This will include war elephants, and the Romans just don't know what to do with these things, and they lose. Of course, however, the most famous is what Hannibal Barca, probably the greatest nemesis of the Roman Republic, does against the Romans. In 218, he crosses the Alps. He, in December, defeats a Roman army about his size, maybe a little bit bigger. In 217, he's going to inflict another catastrophic defeat in central Italy. And then in 216, the Romans are going to respond with overwhelming force, with the largest army probably ever mustered, and they're going to die miserably, maybe up to 70,000 slaughtered by Hannibal. Why in the world does Rome lose so many battles? But more importantly, how do they survive? Well, you can win a battle because battle merely requires the tactical edge of the moment. But as so many people discovered while fighting Rome, you can win battles, but you can't win wars, because winning wars requires an indomitable public spirit. What is that public spirit? We'll get to that question because that's what we're talking about today. But let me ask our second question, because some of you are probably wondering, all right, why should I care? What does it matter? A bunch of long dead farmers, a bunch of people that I don't really care about. Well, you should care because America is based on a lot of things that were borrowed from the Roman Republic. And you see this in our civic architecture. Go to the U.S. Capitol, you see all sorts of classical and specifically Roman features. You see that Roman heroes adorn our statues and our civic architecture. So take, for example, the statue of Alexander Hamilton. If you're not paying too close attention, you'll miss it. There's the Roman fasces down here in the column. Or how about John Cabot, an explorer? Here we have the grass wreath. This is a wreath that would be given to a commander. It would be taken as the highest military honor you could get, because it means that they took whatever they could find on the ground because you did something so impressive, and they would give it to a Roman commander. Or how about Christopher Columbus, surrounded here by a civic award, the oak leaves. That's just aesthetics. We also know the structure of the U.S. Constitution is remarkably Roman. When the founders looked back and they said, we need examples from history, they said, the Roman Republic is the best ancient model, which is why a mixed government, a Senate, popular assembly, age requirements, bicameral legislature, term limits, collegiality, checks and balances, an agricultural republic, Thomas Jefferson's favorite thing, federalism, universal citizenship, public service, citizen soldiers, civic virtue, and civic militarism all look remarkably like what you saw in ancient Rome. Let's just take one hero, one famous American hero. And Americans are so obsessed with Romans that they've got to dress them up like a Roman. And then they got to give words like first in war. The other side says first in peace on the other side. That's princeps pace bellicae. This is the first in peace and war applied to Camillus, a Roman statesman. Or they've got to say that he's the father of his country. This comes from Roman statesmen like Cicero. What about every other American? Well, he's supposed to look like a Roman citizen soldier, which is why patriotism is a Roman with a gladius in one hand and the other hand on the plow. Which is why you've got a New Jersey farmer, one hand on the plow, leaving that plow to defend the very family that he's here with when he picks up his rifle against the dreaded Hessian mercenary. That's the prologue of the book, and here is how I close the prologue. If Americans wish to take their country's history seriously, they must also take seriously the ancient republics that educated their framers. The capital, many of the images that we've seen here, is a complex structure that appropriately identifies the many historical strands that explain how the United States has gotten where it is. Some of these reflect the current of the founding. Some of them indicate later tendencies that sailed against this current. Unless we wish to dismiss historical models entirely, modern Americans must choose from which models they will learn. Rome left a legacy of a republic that was imperfect, but also instructive and inspiring. Its pastoral culture cultivated virtue. Its constitution was well balanced, enabling it to counter corruption. Its citizens were willing to defend and expand the liberties and laws of the republic. If America seeks a future inspired by the virtues of its past, then we must not merely derive inspiration from the founders, we must look to the Roman Republic that inspired them. So that brings us to that second, or the first question, but our answer to that first question. What was this ethos that allowed Rome to survive so many defeats? It's the ethos of the farmer, citizen, soldier. Okay, now let me describe, in the Romans' own words and some of my summaries, what the Roman farm is supposed to look like. We've got an idealization here, but it does have some flickerings of reality from the it's a guy at the very end of the Republican period, a poet by the name of Horace. He's describing farm life, and this is what he says. He says, "The more a person denies himself, the more he will receive from the gods. Destitute myself, I want to join the camp of those who desire nothing, a deserter. I'm eager to abandon the side of the rich, and thus acquire more credit for being master of the wealth I reject." So what's he want? A stream of clear water, a few acres of woodland, a harvest that never lets me down. This is a more fortunate lot. All is well for the man to whom God with a frugal hand has given enough. Or how about this from the satires? "This is what I prayed for, a piece of land not so very large, where there would be a garden, and near the house a spring of ever-flowing water, and up above these a bit of woodland. More and better than this have the gods done for me. I am content." What happens at night when the sun goes down and the farm work is over? Well, he says the kind of conversation that doesn't happen in a crowded city like Rome would later become. And so begins a chat, not about other men's homes and estates, nor whether Lepos dances well or ill. It's the kind of things people talk about in the city. But we discuss matters which concern us more, and of which it is harmful to be in ignorance, whether wealth or virtue makes men happy, whether self-interest or uprightness leads us to friendship. What is the nature of the good, and what is its highest form? So this is my description of the kind of farming culture that we've already seen as described by someone who's at the very end of the Republican period. Here I talk about the smallholder's farm and how it's the foundation of civic virtue. We're going to get an understanding of what civic virtue and civic militarism is. The smallholder's farm was the incubator for Roman moral, physical, and practical education. The home held the family's hearth, before which they worshipped the ancestral gods. Piety and family devotion served as the basis for loyalty to the broader political community. Boys that would become citizen soldiers learned what they could from their parents. Until their mid to late teens, when boys adorned the toga virilis as a sign of their manhood and responsibilities as a citizen, boys learned their family histories, acquired the literacy and mathematics necessary to conduct business transactions, and the practical skills needed for fighting and campaigning. They absorbed the cultural mores of a Roman society, such as respect for authority, honesty, duty, and honor. Roman fathers were expected to instill discipline, frugality, industriousness, and self-reliance and their children. Self-reliance was a valuable Roman character trait. Varro, an author who lived during the time of Cicero and Horace, remarks that nothing should be bought which can be raised on the place or made by the men on the farm. Part of this independence involved the ability to defend oneself and fight in the army. Cato the Elder taught his son to read, but he also trained him in the martial arts of hurling javelins, fighting in armor, riding horses, boxing, enduring extreme temperatures, and swimming. All of this constituted, in the words of Plutarch, his molding and fashioning his son to virtue. Horace has a famous ode on military virtues. It's Ode 3:2. It describes the sort of man Roman fathers like Cato produced. A youngster should be toughened by the rigors of a soldier's life and learn how to put up with the constraints of poverty cheerfully. His physical stamina and ability to kill should terrify his enemies into seeing him as a lion that is savage to the touch and whose rage for blood sends him rampaging through the thick of the carnage. Horace's rhetoric aside, the point was that military training began for the young in their homes. The father especially would guide his son's initial training, introduce him to physical hardship, and demand discipline and responsibility from him. Only the attentive parent could produce a youth that would believe, in the words of Horace, that it is sweet and fitting to die for one's country. So this brings into focus the problems that confronted anyone who engaged Rome on the battlefield. For the enemies of Rome, the qualities of Roman soldiers were less admirable or fearsome than the qualities of their citizens. As soldiers, Romans were often tactically and technologically inferior to their opponents. Despite these soldiering shortcomings, Rome endured and eventually triumphed over every single one of its enemies. The reason for this was that its citizens were more than mere soldiers. The Roman state could absorb such military setbacks again and again until the right opportunity surfaced to win. When Roman armies took the field of battle, what counted most was not the soldier who happened to be a citizen, but the citizen who understood why he fought as a soldier. For these ancient citizens, political protections and legal equality preceded military service, with the result that the republic had to function before the army could. There was no army until the republic was in order. Virtue was not derived from military service. No, virtue was displayed in military service. So that gives us an understanding of what this civic ethos is and how it begins at the fundamental level and then grows out of this. Okay, but what about the other two things that I've talked about? What is a republic and what is a citizen army? Well, it's good to start off with the republic in the words of the republic's best writer, Cicero. This is what he says. Well, then, a commonwealth, a res publica, is the property of a people. But a people is not any collection of human beings brought together in any sort of way, but an assemblage of people in large numbers associated in an agreement with respect to justice and a partnership for the common good. Now, this is a little different from the way a lot of Enlightenment thinkers write about republicanism. Listen to this. The first cause of such an association is not so much the weakness of the individual as a certain social spirit which nature has implanted in man. Okay, now I narrow this definition of Roman republicanism a little bit. Here's what I say. Roman republicanism was a combination of mixed government, anti-monarchism, freedom that is legally guaranteed, and military participation. Sovereign citizens exercising their civic virtue through civic militarism. This kind of citizenship is contingent on a relatively equal body of property-owning citizens that observe the same moral and religious values. Rome had a constitutionally structured polity that was characterized by liberty, divided sovereignty, and participatory virtue. These characteristics originated in and were maintained by structures I referenced throughout this book, such as a civic-based family education, an agrarian economy, public spaces and monuments, the distribution of civic honors, and communal religious rituals. I've made the show stop. There we go. Now, what about a citizen army? What is a citizen army? Now, this definition isn't going to square with a lot of the definitions that we have today about what a citizen army is. People usually look at the American army and say, everyone who serves in the American army, they're a citizen army. It's actually not true. So what is a citizen army? A citizen army, whether ancient or modern, is a marshaling of soldiers designed to defend a polity that is somehow subject to them and represents their interest. This is most readily seen in the citizen soldier's role in authorizing campaigns as part of a legitimate political process. Citizens fight not merely for a governing elite and its interest, but for their own lives, profits, and well-being. Soldiers' loyalty belongs to the public good rather than commanders or themselves. Most importantly, while they exercise allegiance to the state, they nurture prior obligations to their communities, farms, and families. A citizen soldier is to be distinguished from a professional soldier. The former fights by exception to protect his profession, which is something else. The latter, the professional soldier, having no productive or creative profession, fights as his vocation. Peace interrupts his work. Civic virtue in citizen armies manifests itself through frugality, courage on the battlefield, temperance, moderation in politics, and fidelity to the divine. It creates a basic moral community that places the historical values, prescriptions, and customs of the community above private well-being. Families inculcated personal habits that serve that of necessary sacrifice for the community and the public good. Yet civic virtue was not characterized as sacrifice per se. If it worked toward the good of the republic, it was merely a good and proper action. For good and proper personal actions should also be good and proper public actions. And Roman writers saw the relationship between the citizen soldier and the family farm, and the relationship between the citizen soldier as inextricably linked. This is what Cato's On Agriculture says about the farmer. It is from the farming class that the bravest men and the sturdiest soldiers come. Their calling is most highly respected. Their livelihood is most assured and is looked on with the least hostility. Those who are engaged in that pursuit are least inclined to be disaffected. Okay, so I think I've given us enough to understand what is this unique civic ethos that begins on the Roman family farm that expands into the broader idea of a republic and then is defended by civic militarism manifested in citizen armies. Well, that just tells us, hey, this is enough to survive defeats in battle. Now, how do you survive? How do you actually win a battle? Because it's one thing, it's kind of like a Rocky movie. No one wants to watch a Rocky movie where he just sits there and takes all the blows. I mean, that's just not very fun. You need to be able to hit back. So how do the Romans figure out how to hit back? They do this with one word: adaptation. We know politically they are amazing adapters. And we see this here. I map it out, pages 90 and 91. I don't need to go into any of the details, but over the course of several centuries, they slowly, through push and pull, through a tug of war, through compromise, through a great deal of sacrifices, come to an agreement about the kind of republic, the kinds of offices, the kinds of specific people should be leading the republic. It takes a very, very long time. For 100 years, they don't do so well. But by the time we get to around 300, the Roman Republic, the Roman Constitution is a strong apparatus that is properly mixed monarchic elements in their two consuls. They've got assemblies that function as the democracy, and then oftentimes the elite sort of overseeing the whole process would be the Senate. Well, that's their politics. The great thing about Rome is their politics increases Roman citizens, and it also increases Roman allies. And they also take these same virtues of adaptation and they apply it to the military. Okay, so we've got all these people who conquered the Romans. Now let's talk about the fun stuff. How does this adaptation work with military affairs? So I've got some props here on our table. Now let's talk about them one by one, because Some of these might be adapted by the Romans, but a lot of them are adopted by the Romans, by the people who defeated them. So the Romans are really good at saying, man, you guys are awesome. Use these tools to beat us. We're going to take them and use them against you now. So to do this, though, I really need a volunteer. So volunteer, a good strapping lad. You know I'm thinking of you. Get up here, Fritz. All right. Now, my build's a little different, so I hope this fits, all right? You are a massive fella. You would have terrified anyone. This is chain mail, okay? It emerges certainly by the 4th century. We think the Etruscans probably adopted from the Celts. What you're going to do here is slide it over your head. It's actually quite light. You're used to it. You've been in the military. There you go. Watch out for the glasses. There you go. There you go. You got it. Yeah. Glasses are not good for combat. Okay. Yes. Excellent. Excellent. Okay. He's got it. Yeah. Awesome. Man, I gotta say, this looks a lot better on him than it ever does on me. Okay. You can see that the chain mail, it's pretty expensive. So when they start adopting it, either from the Celts, remember those guys who swooped in 390 or 387, or from the Etruscans who defeated them before, when they start adopting it, it's usually only the wealthy who can afford the chain mail, but it's really good at deflecting blows, at preventing perhaps an arrow, maybe a javelin from piercing you. They started off with simply pictorial plates, and then they transition because they realized there are better things that we can be using. All right, so he's got his chain mail that the Romans didn't invent. They're taken from people who've beaten them, and then they're using it to defeat them. But then we've got the iconic helmet. It's on the cover of my book. We're going to protect your head with this nice little cloth, all right? And here, this is the Montefertino helmet. It is the famous helmet of the Romans. Man, again, he looks awesome in it. Almost certainly comes from the Gauls as well. We have a few examples of this, one of the first ones being from Montefertino, which is why it's called this. And if you just look at the Montefertino helmet, again, probably from the Gauls, and if you just watch the development, the adaptation of the Montefertino helmet, it shifts over time. And over time, you'll notice that this neck piece gets longer and longer because the Romans use crouching and they're fighting a lot of times. And so even when they're adopting what other people are using, they're also adapting these to their own purposes. It's the same thing they do in politics. They're doing that same thing in the military. Okay, now we've got one of my favorites, the scutum. This one's easy. You just have to hold, just hold it right there, just like right there. There you go. Now the scutum, this is different than what you're probably familiar with if you know much about Greek warfare. In Greek warfare, what you've got, usually what people think of is the hoplon, which is really good for covering part of the body, but not all of the body. The scutum's different. The scutum is designed to be able to cover the entire Roman, especially if you've got a pair of greaves on. Now, Fritz is a good strapping man. He'd probably build a bigger scutum, but for someone who's a little more average like me, this would cover pretty much all of my body. Now, that's important because he's got to be able to fight as an individual, but he also needs to be able to fight in a unit. When did they adopt the scutum, and from whom did they adopt it? Well, this is debated. It's possible that they started off using this. A lot of Italics are using this. Some of the first examples come from the 5th century. However, they may have switched over and started fighting kind of like the hoplites did in those Greek phalanxes. There's a description in Polybius where he describes how they've done this, but then maybe they shift back. There's another text, the Unicum Vaticanum, that describes how they shift back to a different shield, back to the old shield, the scutum. So maybe for a while they tried the hoplite thing, but then they transition to the scutum. Now, why do they do this? Almost certainly because they're encountering new peoples. Remember we talked about those Samnites who inflicted that catastrophic defeat of the Catalan Forks? Well, now they're fighting in the mountainous terrain. Hoplites don't do well. You go to Greece, all the battlefields, they're in a handful of places in the plains. You don't fight in the mountains. But if you're fighting the mountainous Samnites or the Oscans anywhere along the Apennines, it's good to be able to have this kind of flexibility and a shield that can cover the individual. All right, the pilum. This would be a heavy javelin. There you go. This is also adopted and adapted slowly. It's even very possible. A lot of people say, well, who did they borrow this from? We're not entirely certain. It could have been that they just came up with it themselves. But we know a lot of the italics are using it over the course of the 5th, 4th into the 3rd centuries. By the time they're fighting against those Samnites, they're almost certainly using 1 or 2 javelins. A lighter one, not this one pictured, that you would throw from a further distance, and then this heavier one. Now the heavier one, this also develops more and more over time. So you can watch it over the centuries and how the Romans are constantly perfecting it. Now this is one you throw that when you're right before you come into contact with the enemy, you're going to throw it. Give us a nice good throwing stance. You look awesome. All right, there you go. Now, please don't throw it. I will be fired from Kings. But this is what you would throw it at the enemy. Once again, please don't do that. But throw it at the enemy, and maybe it's going to pierce into the shield. Maybe it's going to pierce into the shield, into the body of a man. Maybe all it does is put this giant iron shank and this giant wooden shaft into the shield, and it makes the shield immobile. But it's going to disrupt and attrite the first ranks of the enemy, and that's the purpose that it's going to serve right before they come into contact. Okay, so we're going to put this thing down. And what brings to mind everyone's notion of the way a Roman fights is this device. What is it? The gladius. Ironically, it's pretty late when the Romans adopt the gladius. But in your mind, this is probably what you think of as a Roman. This is what they have adopted by the time we get to 200. It's very possible, while they're fighting the Samnites, they extend a sword, they want a double-edged sword, and you can use this for 2 things. You can use it for cutting and for thrusting. A lot of maneuvers, so give us an example, just what feels natural. There you go, that's good. Also thrusting, precisely. He's a pro, all right, let's give him an applause, right? Yeah, that's good. This is the Roman swordsman. And this is what has probably animated the Western mind more than anything, aside from maybe the medieval knight, of how Westerners fight their wars. When they throw that pila, they're then going to throw their 2 pila, then they're going to pull out their gladius. And they're going to engage with the enemy. Sometimes he was using spears or pikes. Now notice the kind of mobility he's expected to have. Notice how much has been adapted over the centuries. Notice how they know how to fight in the plains and how they also know how to fight in the mountainous areas. And the gladius, by the time it's adopted, is probably when they're fighting against those Carthaginians that inflicted so many devastating defeats in the 3rd century. By the time we get to 200, this is what the Roman soldier, for the most part, looks like. Okay, everyone give Fritz another good round of applause. So over the course of time, Rome survives these defeats. They learn from their enemies. They adopt their tactics, their techniques, their technologies. And my book from chapters 5 to 7 looks in depth at 3 specific battles. They look at the Battle of Sentinum, where they basically end the major Samnite threat and gain the dominion over Italy. And then I look at how they defeat Carthage. I look at one of my favorite commanders, Scipio Africanus, and how he manages to neutralize the base of Spain at the Battle of New Carthage, or the Siege of New Carthage. And then today, we're going to look at the Battle of Pydna at 168. Battle of Pydna is here. We've seen, so Sentinum is in Italy, New Carthage, all the way over here in modern-day Spain, and then Pydna over in Macedonian territory. You probably have in your mind what Alexander's armies looked like if you've seen the 2004 movie Alexander. Now the movie, like any Hollywood movie, has got its flaws, but I like it. I think it's a fun movie that really captures the essence of a number of features of Alexander. But there's no question when it comes to their depiction of the Battle of Gaugamela, they probably have the best rendition of an ancient battle that's ever been put on the big screen. And I really, really appreciate what they did in that movie. This is a pretty good picture of what that Macedonian phalanx looks like. So you see how they've changed the old Greek hoplite. You see how they have extended the pikes. No longer do we have the spears, now they've got these long pikes. And Polybius describes how when the Macedonians would fight, any individual that is facing up against a Macedonian army could face as many as 10 pikes, because first of all, they're really tight together. See how they've got their shields slung over their shoulders? They do a really good job depicting this in the movie. But then the guys behind them are going to lower their pikes up until the point that they just extend past the first man in the first ranks, which means it's kind of like finding a giant porcupine. It's a really, really difficult thing to penetrate that Macedonian phalanx. Now the Romans They've survived Hannibal, they've beat Hannibal, they've taken over the western half of the Mediterranean, and then they tangle with the Macedonians, the heirs of Alexander. When Aemilius Paulus descends, he's the commander, into the field of where the battle is going to be fought, right before the Battle of Pydna, he looks at that phalanx and he says, oh my goodness, how in the world can we beat these guys? And what does he do in this moment, this very brief moment of very real fear? He puts up a delaying maneuver and then builds a Roman camp. Now, a lot of you are thinking, okay, what to do? They dig some ditches and they put up a little palisade. This is actually a really, really big deal. And it's also a great demonstration of Roman discipline. And it shows you also a little bit of Roman engineering. Polybius says that the Romans like to build their camps as close as possible on the same standard. We see a good example here. This is one sketch based on Polybius. I treat this in my book on pages 182 to 186. We've got the legions arrayed in the camp. We've got the walls. We've got 4 gates, crossroads leading to where the commander would be. And then we've got a little space called a forum. And what you would have in the camp are the tribunes, the guys who are the up-and-coming statesmen, who are managing all the day-to-day affairs of all the citizen soldiers. And all the citizen soldiers are watching them, provide for them, making sure that the guards are where they're supposed to be, making sure that all the passwords are being kept, that everything is in order. The tribunes are learning responsibility here, and the citizen soldiers are watching them. And if someone's really bad as a tribune, then they're going to think about that when they go back home, and they consider whether or not they should vote for this man to be the next commander in the next war, and so on and so forth. Now, what about after a battle? Or what about before a battle, and if someone falls asleep on guard duty? How do you deal out punishment and shame? Well, that's what they have the forum for. This is where public business occurs. And this is where the commander is going to give out rewards. It could be something as simple as a wreath, or it could be a cup, or a certain kind of gear, or a special weapon that a citizen soldier would then take home and proudly put up on his walls. That's how you would reward somebody in front of all of their fellows. What if somebody needs to be punished? What if somebody falls apart on guard duty? Well, they immediately hold a court-martial. And in that court-martial, if he's determined to be guilty, a centurion or a tribune would come up and touch him with a cudgel. And then after that, all of the men who are watching would then stone that gentleman to death. And if he somehow escapes, he would go home and be shunted from, he'd be shunned from entering into his home. Dishonor, shame. In the camp, it's almost like a little microcosm of the Republic. And it shows the discipline, but also the initiative, because people want to be the one who gain the reward, and they don't want to be the one to suffer the shame. Okay, well, they built this camp. The Macedonians have now seen, okay, the Romans are doing something really impressive with their building of the camp. What happens next? Well, the next day, Aemilius Paulus waits to engage against the Macedonians. He wants to wait till the sun is in the right place, so it's in the eyes of the Macedonians and not in the eyes of the Romans. It seems a horse breaks loose, and this is probably what starts the battle. It says that fortune brings them together, fate, maybe someone releases them just to get the battle started. But we see the Macedonian legions begin to close, the Macedonian phalangites begin to close with the Roman legions. Now, there are allies on both sides. There are even elephants on the Roman right wing, which is interesting because the Romans used to be afraid of elephants, but now they're using elephants against their enemies. Remember that adaptation, that adoption that I talked about? Well, everyone knows this is going to be a quick battle because phalanx battles go fast. It's a question of which army breaks first. And the phalangites seem to have the upper hand because they start doing what the phalangites do. That giant, huge porcupine, it's like this robotic spear machine, moves forward and just starts pushing back those Roman legions. A group of Roman allies, trying desperately to save the day, takes a standard and they throw it into the Macedonian lines. And all of the men among the Pylygnians, these are the ones who are fighting with the Romans, they desperately try to go get the standard. It just ends up most of them are impaled. It's horrible. Instead of boosting morale, it's a devastating event. And it looks like this could be the end of the Roman army at Pydna. But then something happens. Then the terrain starts to break up closer to the Roman camp. Well, that phalanx is really good as one compact formation. Really, really good. But what happens when you got to move around a rock, or a hillock moves a guy, or a guy sort of stumbles because he's not looking down, and all of a sudden you lose a little bit of that cohesion. And it's really interesting because Plutarch and Livy have two different stories, and I think Livy's the right one. Plutarch says Aemilius Paulus sees this, and he tells the Roman soldiers, start moving in. Well, first of all, it's impossible for a commander to actually be able to execute that kind of tactical detail in the moment, the way Plutarch describes it. And I also think we should doubt Plutarch because he wants to elevate the muse of his story, Aemilius Paulus himself. The earlier source, Livy, says no. The Roman soldiers themselves, seeing the gaps in the line, do what? They take initiative and they rush in. And that's where the swordsman takes over. And he vies with his fellow. He wants to be the one to cut somebody's head off or sever him on the shoulder or thrust him in a weak point. He wants to be the one to show that he's the bravest among them all. It's the Roman citizen soldier demonstrating that kind of initiative that he has to do in the public forum, demonstrating that kind of initiative he has to have as the son who wants to become his own paterfamilias, his own father, trying to prove himself. It's these Roman citizen soldiers who break into the ranks of the phalangites, and remember, they've got about twice as much space. And remember, you got to fight as a unit, but also as an individual. The Macedonians, they fight for a king. They fight in this tight block. What do you do with this unwieldy pike? They fall victim. And what ends up happening, the Roman armies are going to annihilate the Macedonian forces. And you know what finishes off the battle? What finishes off the battle? The elephants. They come down, stomping and squishing the guys who are desperately trying to get away. I mean, that's not a good way to go, Dumbo toe jam. But that's the end of the battle. And it shows so many things about the Roman legions. But it also tells you about the Roman Republic and how the Romans take their civic ethos and they've now perfected their Roman military machine, and they're applying it on the battlefield. Okay, so this is where, when I first wrote my book, I ended the book, the Battle of Pydna. I sort of left some tantalizing questions. And then I sent it off to Johns Hopkins University Press, and they liked it. But then they said, you know what? We like it, but you need to tell us what went wrong. And this was something I never, ever wanted to touch. I didn't want to do it. I had this 75,000 word text, sent it off. I thought it was pretty good, told the story of the rise of Rome. But they said, no, we need to hear more. And I remember that day. I remember getting that email, going out and sitting in my backyard. I had a beer. I had a couple because, man, I was bummed. I could just see, and this was right before Christmas. I knew my Christmas was toast. I was just going to be working nonstop. What ended up happening was it turned into a 135,000 word book, and that's where chapter 8 came in. Now, why didn't I want to address what went wrong? Well, for two reasons. It is so complicated. It's so complicated and so messy. And two, oh my goodness, it's depressing. And I didn't want to be depressed. There were so many things that I found really, really interesting and unique about the Roman Republic. But it was good for me. It was good for my soul. And it was also good because I got to spend a lot of time with my man, Marcus Tullius Cicero. So what ended up happening was I write this epic chapter 8. It's the longest chapter in the book. I spend a very little bit of time on the Battle of Mutina at the very end of the chapter. But most of this chapter is an analysis of all the things that went wrong. Now, I've only got a handful of minutes left, and I'm going to do something that is just absolutely stupid. I'm going to try to give you 6 words that describe why the Roman Republic fell. This is not wise. People are going to watch this video and they're going to say, the guy's crazy. But I'm going to do that anyway. 6 words, and then I'll offer a little bit of an explanation. So here are my 6 words. The reasons that the Roman Republic fell were uncontrolled militarism. That's our first pair of words. Uncontrolled militarism. Second pair of words. Constitutional stagnation. Constitutional stagnation. And third, moral disintegration. Moral disintegration. I'm trying to sum up the complex reasons for the fall of the Republic with those 6 words. Now, let me define them a little tighter. And let me expand on that a little bit. What is uncontrolled militarism? The Republic experienced unprecedented and rapid growth of territory and influence based on this ongoing successful militaristic drive that we have talked about. The growth was too fast, and it altered what the Republic was and why its armies fought. Rome's civic militarism was a drive that initially was needed to survive, but now it could be turned inward. And instead of devouring others, it devoured itself. This expanding empire brought in so many influences so fast that it also started to alter the culture of Rome itself. Okay, now that's almost getting us to point 3, so just hold on that. That is uncontrolled militarism. Constitutional stagnation. I mean by this, a failure despite several very good attempts to adequately adapt the Roman constitution to the needs of its new empire. The Roman army itself was the best it had ever been, but the apparatus wielding it was outdated. Citizen soldiers were declining, professionalized military men were increasing, provincial governors could gather and then wield enormous power, and Rome clumsily integrated, or rather failed to integrate, old and new allies. All of this was contrary to the Republic that had been so strong from 500 to 150 BC. Our last one, moral disintegration. There was a loss of Roman civic virtue, that ethos or public life of the spirit that had bound the Republic together. The aristocratic body became selfish and acquisitive to the detriment of middling and poorer citizens, including, sometimes especially, citizen soldiers. The monarchic consuls and provincial governors used the unadapted mechanisms of office to concentrate power and wield the armies for political purposes and selfish ends. What does that say about human government?